So if I then move on to the ecosystem project, again, it's collaborative work between me and Jan Bosch. And here we look into the ecosystem dimension of digitalization. And we have started development of a framework. Some of you saw it in the opening presentation this morning, but our intent is basically to provide guidance for companies when moving from more of the traditional towards becoming more digital companies. This involves a number of things: more service-oriented sales, continuous monetization of data, as well as adoption of new ways of working. So a critical part of this project is spent on how do we manage the coexistence of our traditional existing ecosystem and business and the emergent, the new ecosystem. And in the morning presentation in the product community session, for those of you who did not listen into that one, we had a presenter mentioning something that I feel was quite interesting. He phrased it as an ecosystem is not something that you build, but it is something that you deserve, to highlight the importance of relationships and partnerships that are critical for you as a company to really strive in a digital world. To provide a bit of a background, so we see the technologies evolve over time, and this is constant. We have had the mechanics, we have the electronics in the system, we have had software, data, and now most recently artificial intelligence included, added to the systems we build. We refer to the software, data, and AI as the digitalization, the digital technologies, basically. This has a business dimension to it as well. So what we see is typically the mechanics and the electronics, they start to commoditize. They already did. They are critical for a system, but this is not where you have most of your innovation. They are typically not the components where you have the most differentiating functionality. It's becoming harder and harder to differentiate in these. While in the software, the data, and the AI, so within the digital technologies, that's where you see companies spend lots of their innovation efforts, and that's also where they increasingly differentiate themselves. You can also see from a business model dimension that the traditional technologies, the mechanics, the electronics, they are typically monetized in a transactional model, while the more digital you go, the more subscription-based you go, or service-oriented, you could say. There is an ecosystem dimension to this, where for each new technology, there is typically a new partner or new competitor or someone new entering the ecosystem. And then there is a ways of working aspect to this as well, where you for each technology basically have new ways of working. So we knew from already before the DevOps, the continuous ways of working within software, delivery as well as deployment of software. The DataOps and the most recent MLOps is where you then seek to, for example, develop and deploy a machine learning model on a continuous basis using a DevOps fashion approach for your machine learning component development. This is the framework that we have been working with for a couple of sprints now, where we say this is the typical path companies take when going from traditional to digital companies. It involves the product upgrade dimension, going from product sales to a digital offering. It has a business model dimension where you go from very limited service revenue towards complementary services around products. I would say this is where all of the software companies are, more or less. And then at the very top here, you see the multi-sided ecosystem where you basically use data generated by your primary customer base, but that you then monetize with a secondary customer base, which is an interesting future that many companies look to achieve. Not there yet, but something that we definitely see happen. Data exploitation refers to the change in which we use data, going from a pure Q&A and diagnostics perspective to more of a product performance monitoring service, you could say, and then you use it for providing insights to your customers, etc., etc., and then in the end you even sell it to someone else. And then you have the AI, ML, and DL dimension as well. So all of these dimensions are critical for companies to advance in order to move towards more digital companies. In the previous sprint, we did a number of cross-company workshops, and I will also mention a few words about a master thesis project that we were involved in. But to say a few words on one of the topics that I mentioned in the beginning, and that was a major topic, I would say, the coexistence of business models, or you could say the coexistence of ecosystems, because typically the transactional, the product-oriented, the traditional ecosystem that we all know well is one. And then for the more continuous, the service-oriented, the digital, you realize, you see the emergence of something else. But the difficult part is maybe not each of those two, but the coexistence, how to manage these two in parallel in a large-scale organization setting. So first of all, it is problematic. That's what everyone tell us, and that is what we see. It is a real challenge in the software center companies. It involves a number of things. It involves business models, the coexistence of the different business models. You need to be able to have close collaboration. You need to align very different types of partners. And of course, in order to learn about the new, many companies mention the challenge of continuous competence or upskill to build competence and confidence in new things that we are not yet well mature in. So how to even think about our role in these new, for example, more service-oriented ecosystems. What we do realize is that many of the companies try hard to work with this internally. But of course, if you don't validate with your customer, it is a risk that you build something that you actually won't need, or you build the wrong capabilities. So within this project, we have, as one example, been working with one company quite closely in how do you experiment, how do you build learning in a new business model. So working with one selected customer on how to think about a new business model, how to experiment, what is the value of data, for example, how could we sell this to you, and what would you think this is worth, etc., etc. Those types of questions require experimentation, is our experience. And then in the end of this slide here, we saw quite a clear pattern when looking at the software center companies that there are different ways, of course, in which you manage coexistence. Either you have one organization responsible for the two, both the existing and the emerging business models in this case, or you separate the two. So many companies talk about one ecosystem where you do the traditional, the product, etc., and then another ecosystem where you do the new stuff, the continuous, the digital, etc., etc. And you basically separate the internal organizations working with these as well as another approach to manage the coexistence of different things. We also dived into quite a few of the best practices where we again see experimentation as critical. And here the software center companies, they have very, I could say similar, but still different approaches. But common for everyone is that whatever you call it, you work with a selected customer, a friendly customer. Someone say they use customer tribes. Someone call it customer reference groups, etc. But a close collaboration with one or maybe two or at least a few selected customers where you can then try new things to be able to then scale. I think this is critical, since we already know that deployment of something large scale is complex. And the same goes, it's not only the product functionality or the system in itself, it is also the business models for which you sell something. They need experimentation too. Many people mention the active involvement. You really need to be close to your customer and take active involvement to really be able to change something. People talk about advisory role, and you have to make sure there is a win-win. So openness, transparency, and collaboration is what we have learned is critical for exploring new types of value creation and capture. And this is just a simplified version of what we hear many companies refer to when it comes to repositioning, changing something in an existing ecosystem. First, the partners basically say no, because they do not see the value, they feel maybe threatened, and you basically say no. You see a bit of denial, anger, and regret because they feel jeopardized. But after a while, and when you can make it clear what the value will be, they start opening up. So there might be options to explore. And then companies mention that when that has taken off, it's even so that partners start to look for your help to realize ideas, because they need a stronger player to also take leadership. And then in the end, you can have a win-win where partners are proactively moving and where you can together explore new ways of working. I mean, this relates very often to data sharing and how to monetize data, where you as a company as well as your partner look to exploit data for creating value. It's not an easy thing, but with a stepwise process, there is value to be achieved, typically for both partners involved. I will skip this one, and also we see a number of different strategies here. Again, transparency, inclusion, and collaboration. This is where you not challenge, but rather you work together on finding new approaches. You can agree on joint innovation efforts. The strategy 1 and 2 typically go together. There is this, you can separate the atoms and the bits. That is another strategy. And then we have also seen, of course, that in order to move closer to your customer, you may acquire and buy your network partners to actually forward integrate to your end customers. But this is, of course, also something that requires quite careful management of the old and the new. The master thesis students, they explored data monetization. They worked in close collaboration with Zenseact, Tetra Pak, Saab, and DIFE, and they performed workshops and interview studies on how do software center companies or embedded systems companies in general collect, process, and monetize data. That's the basic. How can it be used to create services, and how do you monetize it with secondary customers? So a quite challenging master thesis project, I would say, but they also presented some quite interesting results. That's one of the workshops, where you basically see a maturity timeline on resources, data ownership, the ability to anonymize, the knowledge of secondary customers, and the data valuation ability, where companies then getting advance in their maturity, and you can see it outlined here. What I would want to spend some time on is this model, where they tried to create a sort of a experimentation or funnel model on how to work with creating a secondary customer base. For some of you that are aware of the lean startup, the minimal viable product, the funnel concept, it seems a little bit similar to that one. And they basically use that as a backdrop to help these companies work with data, how to help prioritize among data monetization ideas, how to validate the data collection capabilities, and then how to understand the acceptance from the primary customers of having the data collected from their side to be monetized with someone else, which is of course challenging, could be sensitive, but critical to even be able to exploit data outside of your current customer base. That one will also be published. We have a number of papers for those of you who are interested. And in the coming sprint, we will do two things, or we propose to do two things. One is exploring new business ecosystems without jeopardizing the existing. Still very relevant, still something that companies struggle with, and we need tactics here. You do not want to hurt your current partners, but still you need to continuously evolve. Second is regarding how to build direct relationships with customers. How do you think about this without jeopardizing the existing? How do you evolve the existing, and when do you build a new ecosystem? And how do you have these two exist in parallel? Again, we provide tactics and strategies, and we typically seek for case examples and best practices that we can share among the software center companies.